I remember the exact moment I understood that something was terribly wrong with me. I was 7 years old, standing barefoot on the cold kitchen tiles, and my mother smiled at me. But I didn't see a smile. I saw a crack running through her face, a flicker of something hollow and sad, something leaking through the edges of her expression that no one else in the room registered. My father was reading the paper. My sister was humming. The world was normal, but I felt a pressure in my chest, a terrible knowing that didn't come with words. So I asked her, "Mom, why are you sad?" She froze. The smile tightened into something hard and unfamiliar. "I'm not sad, sweetheart. You're just imagining things. Don't be so sensitive." Her voice was kind, but the message was absolute. What you see is not real. You are the problem. I went to my room and lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling a loneliness so vast it felt like my ribs would crack. Not because my mother was sad, but because I had seen it, and been exiled for seeing it. That night, I learned to shut up, and for the next 2 decades, that silence became a slow, quiet war against my own mind. I walked into rooms and felt the hidden grief hanging in the air like smoke, and I told myself I was anxious. I met people whose words were kind, but whose presence made my skin crawl, and I called it irrational. I sensed disaster coming in relationships, jobs, friendships, saw the small cracks spreading long before anyone else, and each time I stayed, because I'd been trained to believe that the thing I saw was never actually there. Then, in my late 20s, I stumbled onto the work of Carl Jung, and I encountered a single sentence that stopped my breath. The unconscious is not just inside you. It moves through the world, and some people are built to perceive it. I sat with that sentence like a man holding a mirror for the first time in decades. I wasn't broken. I wasn't too sensitive. I was perceiving. And the exhaustion, the isolation, the relentless self-doubt, none of it was caused by what I could see. It was caused by the fact that no one had ever taught me how to hold what I was seeing without drowning in it. This video is about that holding. It's about the 5 profound perceptual abilities that distinguish the deeply intuitive person, and why each one, when unacknowledged, mutates into a form of quiet suffering. We'll move through the architecture of deep perception. You'll recognize yourself in descriptions you've never heard spoken aloud, and by the end, you'll understand that the part of you that always felt like a curse is actually a guidance system that has been running backwards, waiting for you to turn it around. If you've ever felt like you were seeing things no one else could see, feeling things no one else could feel, and then doubting your own sanity for it, you are not losing your mind. You're standing in the doorway of a perception most people will never access, and it's time to learn how to live inside it without letting it consume you. Part 1. The architecture of deep perception. Most people believe perception is a passive act, that we simply open our eyes and the world pours in, faithful and objective. But from a Jungian standpoint, perception is never neutral. The psyche is not a camera, it's a sculptor. It actively selects, interprets, and assembles reality from a flood of sensory and extrasensory data, most of which never reaches the conscious mind. For the majority of people, this filtering process is narrow. They perceive through a familiar frequency band, words, explicit facts, socially agreed upon signals. But for a small percentage of individuals, the ones we often call empaths, intuitives, or highly sensitive, the filters are wider. The unconscious lets in a broader bandwidth. It registers micro-expressions, energetic shifts, tonal dissonance, the weight of unsaid things, and the subtle geometry of psychological patterns. These individuals are not making things up. They are simply processing more layers of reality than the average nervous system knows how to name. Imagine standing in a forest. Most people see trees, hear birds, notice the path, but a perceptive person senses that the silence between the bird calls is slightly too long, that something is moving in the underbrush beyond the visible line, that the atmosphere itself carries a tension that predates their arrival. This is not supernatural. This is the unconscious synthesizing thousands of data points. The smell of recent passage, the behavioral anomaly of the birds, a subsonic rustle, into a single felt impression that arrives fully formed in the chest. That's how intuition works. It delivers the conclusion without showing its math. And for the person who lives this way, childhood often becomes a slow, repeated lesson in self-distrust. You point to the silence between the bird calls, and the world says, there's nothing there. You're imagining it. So you learn to stop pointing. But you never stop sensing. The tragedy is that most highly perceptive people spend decades treating their perceptual system as an illness rather than an intelligence. They pathologize their awareness because it doesn't fit the social model of rational, linear thought. They internalize the confusion, believing they are emotionally unstable or psychologically fragile. But what's fragile is not them. It's the cultural framework that refuses to acknowledge the unconscious as a valid domain of knowledge. Jung spent his entire career mapping this domain, showing that the psyche extends far beyond the ego, that it communicates through symbols, feelings, synchronicities, and non-rational modes of knowing. And he understood that some people are simply closer to this layer of reality than others, not because they're special, but because their psychic structure is tuned to a wider frequency. The question is not whether such people exist. The question is whether they will be destroyed by their own sensitivity, or learn to use it as the foundation of a deeply conscious life. Part 2. The 5 perceptual powers that shape your inner world. Let's now walk through the 5 core ways this deep perception manifests. For each, we'll examine what it is, why it becomes a source of pain when unintegrated, and what it looks like when it's finally brought into conscious alignment. Take your time with these. Let them land. Number 1. Reading the emotional atmosphere. There is a hidden weather inside every room you enter. It has nothing to do with the temperature. It's the psychological field created by the unconscious states of the people present. Their unexpressed grief, their suppressed rage, their unspoken longing. Most people walk through life only half aware of this field. They might notice that a place feels off, or that a conversation suddenly became heavy. But they don't track the subtle shifts with precision. For the perceptive person, however, entering a space is like walking into a musical chord. You can immediately feel if the chord is major or minor, if there's dissonance, if someone is holding an unresolved note. You don't need anyone to tell you that a couple has just been fighting. The air itself is tight. You don't need evidence that a colleague is secretly resentful. The way they arrange their silence says everything. This happens because, as Jung understood, the psyche is not confined to the interior of the skull. It radiates outward, mingling with the unconscious of others, forming a shared field that operates beneath the threshold of ordinary social exchange. Highly perceptive individuals have porous boundaries to this field. They are walking antennae. And when they don't know that what they're experiencing is an external atmosphere, they immediately assume it's theirs. You enter a room where the tension is thick, and suddenly your own mood darkens. You think you're depressed. You join a group where anxiety is humming beneath the surface, and your heart starts racing for no apparent reason. You call it a panic attack. In truth, you're absorbing the emotional weather of the environment and then labeling it as your own pathology. The misstep is identification without discrimination. The corrective is a single life-changing question. Is this mine? Not asked once as a rhetorical shrug, but asked with genuine curiosity. Every time you feel a sudden emotional shift, you'll be stunned by how often the answer is no. That heaviness in your chest? It landed the moment you walked through the door. That inexplicable irritation? It lifted the instant you left the conversation. When you start to track the difference between indigenous emotion and environmental contagion, something inside you unlocks. You stop feeling like a victim of your own moods and start recognizing yourself as a deeply sensitive instrument that simply needs to be calibrated. You can still walk into any room, but now you can also stay tethered to your own center while you do. Number 2, sensing hidden patterns and intentions. You meet someone whose words are flawless. They say the right things, offer the right compliments, perform the right warmth. But somewhere beneath the surface, your body quietly disagrees. It's not a thought. It's a subtle alarm, a tension in your jaw, a slight recoil in your gut, a felt sense that this person is not what they present. You leave the interaction with a vague unease, and then you berate yourself. I'm being judgmental. I have no evidence. Why can't I just be normal? Months later, the mask slips. They betray you, manipulate you, or reveal a cruelty that shocks everyone else. But it does not shock you. Because you already knew. You just didn't trust it. This is the capacity to perceive the gap between the persona and the shadow, between the public performance and the deeper energetic truth that leaks through the cracks. Jung taught that every individual constructs a persona, a social mask designed to navigate the world and protect the vulnerable inner self. This is normal, but in some people, the gap between persona and authentic self is vast and charged. The unconscious always leaks. It leaks through micro-expressions too fast to consciously track. It leaks through tonal inflections, through the way someone's energy pulls back when a certain topic is mentioned. The intuitive mind doesn't analyze these signals individually. It synthesizes them into a gestalt, a single, irreducible feeling of something is off here. The tragedy is that perceptive people are often trained to override this alarm. From childhood, they're told to be polite, to give people chances, to not be so suspicious. So they learn to silence the one system designed to keep them safe. They enter dynamics with people whose intentions are misaligned, and they stay there because they've been conditioned to value social harmony over internal truth. The cost is enormous. Relationships that drain them, friendships that exploit their empathy, professional entanglements that leave them depleted and confused. Integration begins with a radical permission. You are allowed to adjust your distance based on a felt sense alone, without a single piece of admissible evidence. You don't need to justify it. You don't need to explain it. You can choose to move back before the harm manifests. This is not paranoia. This is the honed intelligence of a perceptual system that evolved to detect predators long before they were visible. You can still be kind, still be open, still give people the benefit of the doubt, but you no longer give them the keys to your home while your body is screaming that something is wrong. Number 3, seeing the shadow in others. Every human being carries a shadow, the repository of all the parts of themselves they've disowned, repressed, or never integrated. These are not necessarily evil parts. They can be vulnerability that was punished, anger that was shamed, power that was forbidden, tenderness that was rejected. But because these parts are denied conscious expression, they operate underground, shaping behavior in ways the person does not understand. They fuel irrational outbursts, sudden withdrawals, compulsive patterns, and subtle forms of manipulation. For most people, the shadow is entirely unconscious. But for the highly perceptive person, it is often visible, not as a clear picture, but as a kind of psychological undertow. You can sense the wound behind the arrogance, the terror behind the control, the desperate hunger for love behind the seductive charm. This perception is both a gift and a dangerous trap. The gift is profound understanding. You can see people not as they present themselves, but as the complex, wounded, struggling beings they truly are. You can recognize that the difficult behavior is not who they are, but a symptom of what they cannot face. This makes you extraordinarily compassionate. The trap is that compassion, unchecked by boundaries, morphs into a savior complex. You start to believe that because you understand them so deeply, you are uniquely positioned to heal them. You rationalize their harm. They didn't mean it. They're just in pain. If I love them enough, they'll feel safe enough to change. And so you stay, pouring your energy into the black hole of someone else's unintegrated shadow, slowly erasing yourself in the process. This is where many perceptive people lose themselves. They trade clarity for empathy, boundaries for understanding, self-protection for the hope of transformation. But no one is healed simply by being seen. Insight alone does not catalyze change. Only the person's own willingness to face their darkness can do that. Your role is not to be the lantern that guides them through their underworld. That journey is theirs alone. The integrated use of this ability is discernment. You can see the whole person. You can feel compassion for their hidden suffering. And you can still choose not to stand in the blast radius of their unprocessed pain. This is not coldness. It's the recognition that love without boundaries is not love. It's enmeshment. And true respect for another includes respecting your own limits. Number 4. Foreseeing the trajectory of events. There is a kind of knowing that arrives not as a conclusion, but as a silent orientation in the body. You start a new project, and everything looks promising. The facts line up. The people seem trustworthy. And yet there's a quiet pull in your gut that says something will unravel. It's not fear. Fear is loud and urgent. This is calm, almost detached, like watching the first act of a play and already sensing the emotional arc of the final scene. You try to dismiss it, but it persists. And then, months later, the unraveling happens exactly as your body had anticipated. You're not surprised, just exhausted by the fact that you didn't listen sooner. What's happening here is not magical foresight. It's the unconscious mind performing a kind of perceptual time lapse. The conscious mind processes information linearly and slowly. It needs clear evidence, sequences, logic. But the unconscious works differently. It can hold hundreds of small data points simultaneously. Subtle inconsistencies in a person's story, slight shifts in relational rhythm, tiny structural flaws in a plan, and extrapolate from them a sense of direction. It sees not the end, but the trajectory. And once the trajectory is clear, the end becomes not a mystery, but a matter of time. Jung observed that the unconscious is not bound by linear time in the way the ego is. It can access a kind of temporal depth, where past, present, and emerging future are constellated into a single felt impression. The problem is that acting on this kind of foresight is emotionally costly. To honor a trajectory you sense means to change course now, to leave a relationship that looks good on the surface, to abandon a plan before it fails, to disappoint people who think everything is fine. You will have no proof. You will face confusion, resistance, perhaps loneliness. So instead of acting, you rationalize. You wait. You tell yourself that this time the pattern might break, that you're probably just being cynical. In doing so, you betray your own deepest intelligence. You sacrifice the clarity of perception for the comfort of belonging to the visible order of things. The shift happens when you learn to trust this ability as seriously as you trust your eyesight. You don't have to make rash decisions, but you do have to stop pretending you don't see what you see. You adjust your position incrementally, based on the trajectory you perceive, before the evidence becomes undeniable. That is not paranoia. It's a profound alignment with the wisdom of the unconscious. And when you live this way, you'll notice something remarkable. The long, repetitive cycles of disappointment start to dissolve. Not because the world changed, but because you stopped walking down roads you already knew were dead ends. Number 5. Energetic resonance. The invisible merger. There is a phenomenon more subtle than emotional contagion, and it is perhaps the most exhausting aspect of the perceptive experience. You're sitting with a friend who is deeply anxious. They haven't said much, but their nervous system is broadcasting. Within minutes, your own heart starts to race. Your thoughts become scattered, and a feeling of dread settles into your body as if it belongs to you. You came into the conversation grounded. You leave it shattered, and you don't know why. Or you spend a day around someone who's in a quiet depression. By evening, a heavy fog has descended over your own mind, and you can't shake it. You feel like you've absorbed their very state without intending to. This is energetic resonance. At its core, it's an unconscious attunement mechanism that allows us to feel into the inner world of another person. It's the basis of deep empathy, and it's what makes some people extraordinary listeners, healers, and companions. The problem is that for the highly perceptive person, this attunement often becomes automatic and ungoverned. The boundaries between self and other dissolve without consent. You don't just understand another person's emotional state, you merge with it. You feel their anxiety as your anxiety, their grief as your grief, their chaos as your chaos. By the end of a day of interactions, you feel like you've lived multiple lives, and you're too exhausted to locate your own. The cost is not just fatigue, it's a gradual erosion of identity. When you constantly absorb the states of others, you lose track of what is genuinely yours. You become a composite of everyone you've been with. This can create a terrifying inner fragmentation, a sense that you don't know who you are because you're always becoming whoever you're near. Many perceptive people cope by isolating themselves, not because they dislike people, but because every interaction feels like an existential threat to their stability. They become hermits, not by nature but by necessity. Integration here requires a deliberate practice of inner anchoring. Before entering any deep interaction, you take a moment to feel your own feet on the ground, the rhythm of your own breath, the texture of your own emotional baseline. While listening to someone, you maintain a split attention. A part of you stays with them, attuned and compassionate, while another part of you remains gently tethered to yourself. After the interaction, you take a moment to consciously release what isn't yours, imagining it falling away like dust, or exhaling it with intention. This is not esoteric fluff. It's psychological hygiene. Over time, you develop the capacity to be deeply present without being colonized. You become someone who can hold space without becoming the space. This is the hallmark of mature empathy, the ability to feel everything without becoming everything. Part 3. The dark night of the perceptive person. Having mapped these 5 abilities, we must now face something uncomfortable. Why do so many highly perceptive people spend years, even decades, in a state of quiet anguish? The answer lies in what Jung called the unlived life, the gap between the innate self and the conditioned self. From early childhood, the perceptive person receives a double message. Internally, they receive an overwhelming stream of data about the emotional world. Externally, they receive constant invalidation. You're too sensitive. Stop overthinking. Why can't you just be normal? This creates a psychic split. The conscious ego learns to suppress and dismiss the very perceptions that could guide it, while the unconscious continues to broadcast signals that are now treated as noise. The result is a life lived in a state of permanent internal friction. This friction often masquerades as anxiety. Not ordinary anxiety about specific threats, but a free-floating existential unease that never fully resolves. What's actually happening is that the conscious mind is ignoring the unconscious mind's reports, and the unconscious, in turn, becomes louder, using physical symptoms, emotional overwhelm, and intrusive feelings to try to get attention. The body becomes the battleground. Chronic fatigue, unexplained aches, emotional volatility. These are not always signs of pathology. Sometimes they are signs of a perceptual system that has been silenced for too long and is now screaming. The dark night comes when you realize that the strategies you've used to survive, people-pleasing, over-intellectualizing, numbing, hiding your true self, are not protecting you, but imprisoning you. You realize that you've built your personality around making others comfortable, and in the process, abandoned the very sensitivity that made you who you are. This recognition is painful and liberating in equal measure. It's the beginning of what Jung called individuation, the journey towards psychological wholeness, where the ego learns to dialogue with the unconscious, rather than suppress it. Part 4. Individuation. The reclaiming of perception. Individuation is not about becoming a different person. It's about becoming who you already are beneath the layers of conditioning. For the highly perceptive individual, this means learning to relate to the 5 abilities, not as burdens to manage, but as instruments to play. The unintegrated empath feels an emotional atmosphere and is swallowed by it. The individuated person feels the same atmosphere and asks, "What is here? What does this tell me? And what, if anything, do I need to do?" They maintain the pause. In that pause, they find freedom. This pause is not suppression. It's the cultivation of what some traditions call the witness, the part of consciousness that can observe without becoming entangled. You don't stop feeling. You stop identifying with every feeling. You learn to say, "Ah, there is anxiety here, and it may not be mine." That simple shift changes everything. It transforms perception from a passive ordeal into an active, conscious engagement with the hidden layers of reality. Individuation also involves reclaiming your right to boundaries without guilt. Many perceptive people were raised to believe that their only value came from caretaking, from being the emotional support for others. To step back, to say, "I see your pain, but I cannot carry it for you," can feel like a betrayal of your identity. The guilt can be crushing. But Jung was clear. True compassion cannot flow from a depleted self. Individuation demands that you become the guardian of your own psychic territory, not by building walls, but by developing a core so strong that you can be open without being invaded, present without being consumed. You learn that you are not here to save everyone. Your only responsibility is to live your own truth as fully as you can. The final stage of this process involves a quiet acceptance of solitude. When you see what others don't, you will sometimes stand alone. You will perceive dynamics that cannot be verbally proven. You will feel truths that the collective denies. This can be lonely, but only if you seek external validation for your inner reality. The individuated person learns to hold their perceptions with calm authority, without needing to convince anyone. They become a quiet center in a noisy world, witnessing the currents of human interaction without being swept away. That solitude is not emptiness. It's the space where the soul can finally breathe. Part 5. Integration. Living from the center. So, what does a life of integrated perception actually look like? It looks like walking into a crowded room and feeling the emotional weather without being overcome by it. You register the tension, the sadness, the hidden competition, but you don't take it on. You can acknowledge it, perhaps adjust your behavior accordingly, but your own equilibrium remains intact. It looks like meeting a charismatic stranger and sensing the dissonance beneath their charm, and then choosing to proceed slowly, not out of fear, but out of respect for your own inner compass. It looks like being in a relationship where you see your partner's shadow clearly, and instead of trying to fix it or absorb it, you hold steady, loving boundaries that invite them to do their own work, while you do yours. It also looks like catching yourself when you start to merge energetically with someone's distress. You feel the pull to dissolve, to take on their mood, to become their emotional container. And in that moment, you re-anchor, you breathe, you remind yourself, I can care without carrying, I can love without merging. And you stay present, but now from your own center, not from theirs. This is not a state you achieve once and then maintain effortlessly. It's a moment-to-moment practice. Some days you'll slip, absorb, drown. That's human. But the practice is to return. Again and again, you return to your center. And with each return, the path becomes more familiar, and the time spent lost in borrowed emotions becomes shorter. Eventually, you become a person whose sensitivity is no longer a liability, but a profound source of wisdom, creativity, and depth. Closing insight here is the truth that took me 3 decades to understand, and I offer it to you now as a kind of quiet torch. You are not broken. You are not too sensitive. You are simply seeing more of the world than most people have been trained to acknowledge. And that seeing, when you stop fighting it, becomes the most reliable compass you will ever have. It will guide you away from people and places that would quietly destroy you, and toward a life that feels aligned, spacious, and deeply your own. You don't need to feel less. You need to trust what you feel, and learn to hold it without becoming it. That is the work. That is the practice. That is the doorway into a life where your perception is not your prison, but your path. Imagine tomorrow morning, walking into your first interaction of the day, and instead of bracing yourself, you rest in a quiet inner knowing. You feel what's there, you understand what's beneath, but you are not swallowed. You respond with clarity instead of reaction. You keep what's yours and release what's not. That is not just